Ideally, to talk about pedagogy, one has to, I prefer to have an interactive framework. And I tend to start by asking colleagues as to what do they have in their mind when they hear the word pedagogy. Uh, does it ring any kind of practical interest? Does it sound like something which they have been already doing? Or pedagogy is yet another conceptual tool which may be safely located in this textbook or that reference book or in that encyclopedia, or it is something closer to us as teachers. Ideally, it is supposed to be closer to us as teachers. It is supposed to be part of our everyday life as teachers. We think in terms of pedagogy every now and then. Even this is my submission that even a bad teacher is a pedagogue in some sort of way. Why? Because good or bad teacher, evil or bad, and actually it takes us beyond good, bad, evil. Ultimately, all of us as teachers plan our lessons, think about, in advance, we think about what we are going to teach, how we are going to conduct our classes, what are we going to do in the classes. Even if we just do delivery in lecture mode, we tend to employ certain kind of skills. We tend to also implement certain imagination about how this material should be transacted, how a particular material should be transacted in the classroom. We do selection of texts. We try to also pre-plan as to what elements of the text would be highlighted in the discussion in the classroom, how we would be inviting our students to join in certain kind of collaborative effort to make sense of a particular lesson. All these questions guide us as teachers. Informally as well as formally, we keep thinking along this line, which means we are pedagogue at the core of our vocational existence, or if you want to say professional existence, though there is difference between vocational existence and professional existence. In professional existence, we might be doing all sorts of things, including teaching and learning, primarily to fulfill professional requirements, to obtain certain kind of marks in the academic mathematics, academic calculation, to work toward promotion, to write books and publish so that we get those marks and also we get some recognition. That is typically professional existence of a pedagogue. But then I suppose no pedagogue can be at ease with merely professional existence. Eventually, it seeps into our vocation, which means it becomes part of our calling, right? And everything that we do is somehow related to that sense of calling. If it were not sense of calling, if it were just a matter of uh, earning salary or earning certain kind of utilitarian benefits, then we would have safely changed our profession. But the fact that we stay on with this profession of teaching and learning and in the business of this knowledge enterprise is precisely because somewhere this whole practice has become part of our calling, which means that even though we fulfill professional requirements, we are actually in a kind of vocation. And vocation never allows us a vacation, to put it very wittily, right? In vocation, even vacation becomes part of our efforts, our endeavors, our pedagogic endeavors, so to say. Now, this much of noble talk about the idea of pedagogy requires us to briefly reflect upon the basic tenets of this idea of pedagogy. I propose, from what I have gathered from various educationists, philosophers, sociologists who have talked about pedagogy, even historians have talked about pedagogy. From there, one can gather some of these basic tenets, and I try to simplify it by putting it into two parts. One part of pedagogy is essentially very artistic. It has strong aesthetic structure to it, which means it requires us, the teachers, to be very imaginative, very creative, also innovate once in a while in terms of the methods of teaching. We are not content with only the content of course. We also seek to figure out as to how to deliver this content in most effective and efficient manner, right? And for that matter, we go beyond ourselves as teachers and we start thinking of our students. We start thinking through them. And that is why we have series of conversation with the students. We talk to them so as we could understand as to what kind of methods would work. We talk to them and we figure out as to how we need to imaginatively and creatively transact this material, how to really forge a relational transaction between teacher and students. That part is essentially very artistic. One can also say it's a craftsman's prerogative. All the teachers, male, female, are craftsmen and craftswomen in that sense. If they are pedagogic, if they are worried about pedagogy, if they are thinking in terms of pedagogy, it means they have accepted certain kind of art and craft. They are working with that art and craft. And in that regard, I suppose some of the philosophers have helped us understand as to how teachers are essentially artists of some sort. They may not be doing visual art, they may not be doing stage performances, but teaching as performance in the classroom has been a subject of analysis amongst a lot of American educationists, Latin American, European educationists, and also in India, some of the educationists such as Krishna Kumar and others would help us understand the art of teaching, precisely because of the component of pedagogy. So that is one part of pedagogy. The second part of pedagogy is to do with our aptitude. How do we think? Intellectually, how are we oriented? How are we wired? Right? What is our way of seeing as a teacher slash scholar? How do we see things around us? How do we see classroom situation? How do we see the profile of students in the classroom? Or how do we see the location of a classroom in an institution? And furthermore, if you keep broadening this, it's an aptitude. Pedagogy is an aptitude which enables us to see our location in classroom, in institution, in a nation state, in a particular kind of geography, in the society, surrounded by all sorts of forces. It's an ability to make sense of all those forces which conditions us as teachers and students, all the forces to which we respond in some way or other. Sometimes, and somebody can say most of the times, our responses to these forces around us is in the manner of submission, surrender. We more often than not tend to surrender because we are teachers, we are not fighters in the battlefield, we surrender. Whatever diktat comes to us from anywhere, we surrender, we accept it, right? So that is where we become some sort of cog in the larger machinery of structure. Pedagogy is an aptitude which enables us to see as to how we have become cog in the larger machinery and how this cog can indulge in certain kind of struggle as well to assert oneself. So these are the two broad parts. I essentially also tend to see strong relation between pedagogy and reflexivity. This is another term which I have proposed to deliberate upon in this discussion. Reflexivity too has a long journey, largely starting in epistemology, philosophy, then coming to social sciences, and particularly in sociology and history and other social science disciplines. The term reflexivity has found lots of currency. What does it mean? It means a lot of things to a lot of people, but to simplify it further, one would say that it means ability to look at upon oneself, ability to look backward and forward, ability to see one's own position, ability to reflect over a particular situation in which one is involved. Reflexivity demands one to take an ontological turn, which means start thinking of everything that we do in terms of intellectual deliberation. Start thinking of all those things in relation with our existence, in relation with who we are, where we are located, where we come from, what are we made up of, right? So reflexivity in that sense is a good guarantee that a pedagogue, while doing pedagogy in the classroom, also outside the classroom, in university, in college premises, while talking to students in this forum or that forum, or even if no forum, maybe over a cup of tea, while doing all those things, the pedagogue is actually implementing some kind of pedagogy which involves great deal of reflexivity, which involves this ability to forge a good relation with students, which means pedagogy, along with reflexivity, ensures that teaching and learning both would be a relational exercise. It would not merely amount to coaching a class to pass this examination or that examination. That too would be an outcome of a pedagogue's delivery, the larger process of teaching and learning. But then that is not the mere outcome that a pedagogue seeks to achieve. The outcome of this kind, utilitarian kind, in which a student, after attending a lecture, after attending a course, would be able to score in the exam in this manner or that manner. That outcome also happens, but then there is a larger outcome which guides the pedagogue, one who is informed by the idea of pedagogy. And the larger outcome is that there would be a relational enterprise of teaching and learning, in which, more often than not, a teacher will also discover something new in the process of teaching and learning. Just like students are obviously discovering a lot of new things. So with this kind of, that also comes with the fact that a pedagogue is essentially a reflexive creature, right? So these are the basics I thought I should spell out before I get into uh, the idea of being a pedagogue, using pedagogy in a very ordinary kind of scheme. This is necessary to be said. Why? Because more often than not, I have heard from some of the colleagues that pedagogy is a very specialized kind of thing, which may be suitable for school teachers, but it may not be suitable for college teachers or university teachers. It's a big misnomer, right? Because pedagogy is not that specialized thing. Pedagogy is not that science which will be available only for experts who have gone through uh, rigorous training in pedagogy. No, not necessary. Pedagogy comes from practice. And as I said right in the beginning, that almost everybody who has taken to the profession of teaching and learning, to add, is some kind of pedagogue, right? So pedagogy is a generic art which is related to the practice of pedagogy. It's not necessarily related to a canon of pedagogy. There is no one holy book which can stand for this art of pedagogy. There has to be a variety of micro narratives in support of this pedagogy. On one hand, pedagogy is discussed in most of the texts as certain kind of universal enterprise, but on the other hand, it also opens up the possibility to localize this art, localize this craft, localize this in the sense that, the personal experiential narratives of scholars, teachers, learners would come into the picture. And it is there that I tend to invite teachers, students to think of pedagogy in relation with who they are, where they are located, what they are doing, and how how do they intend to carry it forward. Um, Pandemic, because we are discussing this in the when the pandemic is ongoing. Pandemic was a time when we realized the necessity of revisiting pedagogy far more strongly than ever before, and we realized it with this clear idea that if we have to switch to online mode of education, we probably need to strengthen pedagogy more than ever before. Why? Because in online mode of education, it's very much possible that both teachers and students would get disillusioned sooner or later. If it were for strong pedagogic imagination, on the part of teachers, strong, consistent pedagogic endeavors which would keep both students and teachers synergized. Only by doing that, one can probably make online mode of teaching and learning a vibrant experience. And that is where I tend to contextualize today's discussion on pedagogy by suggesting that as teachers, most of us during in the last 2 years might have felt the necessity of reinventing our craft. And it is in that regard, it is with that concern of reinventing our craft, it becomes necessary to return to the idea of pedagogy. Of course, with due sensitivity to the context in which we are talking. And when we talk of pedagogy in today's time, we are reminded of some of the lessons that we learned from some of the philosophers. Let me share with you a text that I recently did for a journal, and that text might be slightly helpful in understanding as to what it means when I say doing pedagogy with due context sensitivity. If we take a teacher to be an artist, which we have done right at the onset of today's discussion, if we take a teacher to be an artist, perhaps it becomes a compulsive necessity to draw an equivalent between teachers and tragedies. Following the maverick existential philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, just like an embodied experience of tragedy triggers immense existential aesthetic energy in an artist, we could expect the teachers to let their practices be inspired, instigated, and invigorated in the time of pandemic. Is it too much of wishful thinking? Are we expecting too much from the salaried professionals called the teachers? After all, in the regime of old normal before pandemic, when classes were conducted in real spaces and all the practices had very well structured tangibility, teachers only enacted the prescribed roles. Not really like automatons in a Kafkaesque thriller. Franz Kafka's thriller has human characters almost enacting the behavior of an automaton. Unlike them, the teachers, even in the old normal, happened to be minds at work, following a preordained recipe, formulas, and the book of bylaws. If they had too much of agony, too much of pain, they wrote op-ed articles or gossiped with trusted colleagues in the corners of staff room, or simply resorted to consulting a psychiatrist if they fell really ill. Translating tragedies into a teaching force required the teachers to creatively take pedagogy, which they found too taxing a job perhaps. And hence, mostly they all subscribed to teach, to fulfill the official job, research, write, publish for professional advancement, and that is celebrated as a job well done. However, we need to depart from this kind of status quo. When we try to depart from this kind of status quo, we are actually allowing the pedagogy as an art, as a craft, and as an aptitude to come back to us with full force. Specifically in the precincts of higher education, pedagogic concerns were left out for only a few of the teachers who perpetually worried about the question how to teach. Exceptional teachers also pondered upon another fundamental idea, how to teach or how to be a teacher. And accordingly, they deemed it necessary to rethink what and why to teach. Such educationists' deliberations dealt with the tragedies of the pedagogues. For the larger varieties of teachers, however, tragedies, if any, were deemed only as sporadic problems of the excessively sensitive types of teachers. Some of the senior peers, therefore, invariably advised the newly joined young lecturers and professors saying, don't worry about teaching. It is not to supersede your scholarship. Teachers conform to the established norms, and thereby pedagogy seldom enters their prized purview. Scholarship, research writing, publication, more often than not, were preponderant over teaching, pedagogy, and pedagogues' freewheeling collaboration with the students in the teaching learning practices. One can say there was little normal in the so-called old regime of normalcy before the advent of the pandemic-driven singularity of the online education. Anybody could recall the lessons we learned from someone like Michel Foucault about the ways of disciplining in the process of education, ways of controlling of mind and body, morally ascertained technical management, reaffirmed power of the most powerful, perpetual docile bodied teacher and taught, and the hegemony of what Foucault called crypto educationalists. Those crypto educationalists actually rule the institutions of education. Many teachers, many of us teach Foucauldian critique of the systems, and yet we never allow this critique to enlighten the teaching learning practices. It is in this context, which multiplied intellectual, emotional, and institutional tragedies of the teachers, along with the taught in recent times, we need to return to the idea of teacher with pedagogic imagination, aspiration, and will to enact a relational mode of teaching practice with their students. And that is how the teachers will remain an efficient, veritable artist dealing with Nietzschean tragedies that I mentioned in the beginning. The art of being a teacher, which pedagogy essentially is about. The art of being a teacher during the pandemic, before the pandemic, and even afterwards would require us to be phenomenologically attuned, reflexive enough to take a stock of our academic practices independent of the structures in which we are located. A strong orthodoxy about teaching social sciences has been dominant across South Asia for a very long time. It has degenerated into a variety of, institutional monoliths. One can also say there is a kind of academic Brahmanism which dominates this institutional monoliths. If one reflects on the practice of teaching in this kind of time, one realizes that, the structural monoliths, institutions with hierarchy, strong hierarchy in place, they create a very unique kind of liminality, unique kind of spaces here and there where a pedagogue can independently execute his or her art and craft, his or her aptitude that enables them, the pedagogues, to take note of the situation and accordingly strategize, accordingly plan. This I am saying not just to romanticize the idea of pedagogy or romanticize the idea of reflexivity. I am saying this in spite of my well-reasoned understanding of the structural problems with education. A lot of scholars have helped us understand as to how not only school system, also in higher education institutions, universities, we have great deal of structural constraints put upon teachers and pedagogues and students. And in that kind of situation, it seems almost difficult, impossible to imagine that there could be a space for pedagogy left. But then a lot of scholars have also talked about pedagogue as mavericks. Pedagogue as mavericks. What do mavericks do? I recall one educationist, historian educationist, Rajan Gurukul, based in Kerala. He gave us this idea recently in one of his journal pieces about maverick professors. And he said that in his article, he said that that a maverick professor and I extend it to maverick pedagogues, can dismiss the, I'm quoting him, dismiss the stale routine of imposing syllabus driven lessons upon their students and concentrate on the task of teaching how to learn, stimulating curiosity, promoting higher cognitive levels, and rendering emotional support. This is what is expected of the maverick pedagogues who are ready to employ pedagogy as an art, craft, and aptitude. They are supposed to not just carry out a given syllabus, carry out the task of teaching in most mechanical fashion, or carry out evaluation and elimination of students. They are also supposed to be doing great deal of stimulating of curiosity. They are also supposed to promote higher cognitive levels, and through relational enterprise of teaching and learning, they are supposed to generate emotional support. This is pertinent ideal to work towards while taking notes of what tragedies would unfold alongside. We understand that structurally, system of education is mostly about taming the shrew, if I can borrow the idea from Shakespeare's drama. It's also about, you know, metaphorically about breaking horses so as the horses allow the saddle, the riddle, and the rider upon themselves. Mavericks among teachers and students are structurally the shrew to be tamed, the horses to be broken, and the minds and anatomical entities to be disciplined into docile bodies of Michel Foucault, the docile bodies which Michel Foucault talked about. It is in such kind of backdrop that we need to return to the idea of an ordinary pedagogy in the time of pandemic. One also says all over the world, people have been also talking about pandemic pedagogy, which is very ordinary kind of, which is basically about recalling the forgotten ordinariness which comes from the practically executed pedagogy. Uh, because these things are very ordinary. All the ideals that I have mentioned with reference to Rajan Gurukul, the historian educationist, are very ordinary attributes of humankind, isn't it? Like rendering emotional support, generating curiosity. These are supposed to be done by any means, by any teacher, by anybody who is in relation with one another. But then what happens is that in the time of pandemic, particularly, we saw that in addition to the structural order, the institutional order which governed us, there also came into picture a technological order. Many Latin American, some of the Latin American and European educationists have criticized this technological order which came into picture with the advent of online mode of education. And they have criticized technological order precisely by employing pedagogy as an aptitude, which I discussed right in the beginning. And likewise, I suppose the colleagues who I am addressing through this discussion, they are also invited to think along this line as to how pedagogy as an aptitude can enable them to make sense of their situation, make sense of all kind of knee jerks, ad hoc measures, and upside down thrusting of instruction that resulted into techno managerial kind of quick fix solution to the pandemic based online education mode. By taking note of the situation, probably teachers today will have the ability to uh, perpetuate the idea of pedagogy, which I discussed in the beginning, and also continue to perform and figure out the ways of performing it. Um, they, this certainly also would involve certain kind of uncertainty, because students also come up with their expectations. Their expectations might be that, you know, teachers will just speak in the microphone, they would be absent from the screen, or they would just log in and be absent from the screen, and that's the class done. They have also discovered all kind of digital version of kunjis, guidebooks, which would help them far better in writing ready-made answers to some of the questions we ask in the examination. By the way, once one has started implementing pedagogy as an art and craft and aptitude, one would also, as a teacher, rethink the kind of questions we frame in the examination. We would not be asking questions about, how to define this term or define that term, how to explain this term. We would not be asking a question which will be answered simply by this or that Kunji book. Instead, our questions would be related to the everyday situation of teachers and students, of the context in which one is located. And in that, coming together of text and context, the prescribed texts from which students will learn and the context in which a student is learning, both of them would be brought together only if teachers begin to ask very different kind of innovative questions. Moreover, this whole process is also rife with uncertainty, in the sense that students may or may not take you as seriously as they did in the face-to-face communication when you had in the classroom. These are some of the limitations which one would come across while practicing as a pedagogue. There would be situations of utter frustrations too. Just like students get frustrated, teachers too have their rights to get frustrated. But then what to do? I remember Paulo Freire, one of the great educationists of our time, who would, on one hand, give us a classical work such as Pedagogy of Oppressed. On the other hand, he would also give us Pedagogy of Hope. And in between Pedagogy of the Oppressed and Pedagogy of Hope, we, the pedagogues of today, have to find a way in the relationship between teachers and students, and not a way out. So with that kind of remark, I would stop by recalling that there would be limitations, there would be moments of frustration, but a pedagogue is a die-hard optimist, a creature who would return again and again to the art and craft of teaching, would always rethink the ways in which a course content should be transacted, would always rethink the way in which a question should be framed, inviting a student's imaginative, creative ability to connect the text and the context. In that regard, one can say that pedagogy also allows the teacher and a student to start playing with the things rather than be a disciplined and disabled kind of creatures who would not have freedom, intellectual freedom, to play with the materials which they learn in the classroom.